Good evening. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the New York Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Martha Hodes. I'm interim director of the library's Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Please note that this event is being recorded. We encourage you to remain masked, and I kindly request that you silence your cell phones. Thank you. Before I introduce our lecture series and this evening's esteemed speaker, let me say a word about the Cullman Center. The center, it's up on the second floor, selects 15 fellows each year, among the best and most promising academics, journalists, creative writers, artists, and translators at work today, who come to the library to gain intensive access to our collections. You can find the application online, where you can also find our public programming, Conversations from the Cullman Center. Our new lineup will begin in September. Now to this evening. The Cullman Center biannually presents a series of 2 Joanna Jackson Goldman Memorial Lectures in American Civilization and Government. The pandemic precluded a program last year, so we're back tonight joyously after a 3-year hiatus. To join us again tomorrow, same time and same place, you can register on the library's website. Who was Joanna Jackson Goldman? These lectures are made possible by the estate of her husband, the historian Eric Goldman, who, among many other accomplishments, taught an immensely popular course on modern American history at Princeton University. Eric Goldman collaborated with Daniel Kevles, a past Cullman Center Fellow and Professor Emeritus at Yale University, to celebrate Joanna Jackson Goldman. I extend my very warm gratitude to Dan, who's with us this evening, and to Alan Porter, the executor of the Goldman estate, who created this endowed lecture. Joanna Jackson Goldman was a minister's daughter from West Virginia who loved books. She was, these are Dan's adjectives, courageous, iconoclastic, compelling. She was an advocate for competing ideas and animated debate. And she was a believer in the promise of American democracy and the battles necessary to fulfill that promise. In her honor, the Goldman Lectures strive to encourage provocative comment and analysis of contemporary issues of deep and long-term significance for American democracy. Accordingly, our distinguished speaker this evening, Jamelle Bouie, will address a most pressing question: what's the matter with American democracy? Followed tomorrow evening by a sequel, The Future of American Democracy. After each lecture, we invite questions from you, the audience. The lights will come up a bit, and please feel free to line up at the microphone that will be set up in the center aisle. Many of you are familiar with Jamelle Bouie from his columns in the New York Times. You may also have heard his podcast, Unclear and Present Danger. You may have heard him interviewing historians on the Ezra Klein Show, or you may have heard him being interviewed about the Civil War era on the podcast called You're Wrong About. Jamelle is also a talented photographer. You can find his weekly images posted on the New York Times website. He also frequently appends his favorite recipes to his columns. Do have a look. In his New York Times columns, Jamelle Bouie's principal concern is the undermining and subversion of American democracy, the counter-majoritarian and anti-democratic workings of the American political system today. Jamelle Bouie's great gift to his readers is his rigorous invocation of history, appealing to the American Revolution, the nation's founders, the Constitution, the fractious and yes, polarized new nation, the history of American capitalism, the Supreme Court, slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the era of Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and beyond. Listen to the titles of a few of his columns. 1820 has a lot to tell us about 2020. Cancel culture in 1832 sounded pretty fierce. January 6th and 1866. This is Jim Crow in new clothes. In an essay on the murders in a Buffalo, New York supermarket last month, Jamelle wrote, "It's not as if this comes out of nowhere. And yet, Jamelle Bouie's invocations of history are never simplistic. As he wrote in the column reflecting on 1820 and 2020, there is no one-to-one comparison from the past to current events. In a column about our endangered free and fair elections, he wrote, "We can be shocked, but we shouldn't be surprised. Why not? Because Jamelle Bouie documents a persistent strain," that's his phrase, a persistent strain of undemocratic exclusion from the start of the nation's history. Just a final word of introduction. Joanna Jackson Goldman believed in the potential of the United States. In Professor Dan Kevlis's paraphrase, quote, "If only people would stop and think." Jamelle Bouie, too, wants us to, in his words, in a column he wrote about why it took more than 100 years for Congress to pass an anti-lynching bill, he wants us to, quote, "pause and reflect." Please join me in welcoming with warm anticipation, Jamelle Bouie.
Thank you for the very warm applause. I can't see any of you, but that's okay. I am very much looking forward to speaking. Thank you to Martha for such a kind and lovely introduction. And I hope that this talk, this conversation we have is fruitful for all of you, and I look forward to our questions afterwards. But let me begin. Let me get started. If you asked a intelligent, worldly, informed group of Americans the question, what's the matter with American democracy? If you asked them this in 2022, I think you would get a couple pretty similar answers depending on where they stood on the political spectrum. Disinformation would be one answer. Misinformation, which is distinct but similar, would be another one. Cancel culture would be another answer. And probably someone would say Donald Trump, which is the obvious answer. If you exclude Donald Trump for a moment, what you would get, essentially, is an epistemological diagnosis of American democracy, right? That the issue, the problem, is that Americans are either spreading bad information, they're getting bad information, or they're doing something terrible with the information that they have, which is probably itself bad. I think this is all, it might well be true, but I think it doesn't really matter all that much. The United States has long been a place where information has not been particularly accurate, where it's spread widely and not been particularly good, where Americans have acted on poor information for ill, right? This is not a new thing about American society. I don't think the problem with American democracy right now is that people need to know more or necessarily be more educated in the sense of getting more accurate information about the world. At the risk of sounding a little tautological, I think the problem with American democracy is that it really isn't all that democratic, that American democracy is missing core elements of what it means for a nation to be a democracy. I think the core element that we're missing in particular is what you call political equality. And I think the absence of political equality for American democracy is kind of a big deal. I think that rectifying the absence of political equality from American democracy would leave us with a democracy and a political system that functions much better, that better matches our democratic instincts and our democratic aspirations. And I think that it could help us head off some of the things that might be coming our way. I'm gonna walk you through all of these thoughts, but before I do want to start with a phrase I'm sure many of you have heard. If you're here, you've heard this phrase. We're a republic, not a democracy. I think my editor is here, and he knows this drives me insane. This is a phrase that drives me mad. If anyone who spends enough time writing and thinking publicly about American democracy, about our political system, anyone who says openly that they think the system isn't democratic enough will likely encounter this phrase from a reader or a commentator or someone, usually phrased in kind of the form of a gotcha, right? Like, well, we're a republic and not a democracy. I'm sorry to say to this person I kind of just made up that it's not a particularly good gotcha. For the framers and the ratifiers of the Constitution, democracy did not generally mean a system of representation and majority rule. What they created, which is what they were created, that's what we have, and that's generally what people mean when they talk about democracy, a system of representation, and within that, some form of majority rule. The men who led the revolution and who devised the Constitution were immersed in classical literature and political theory, and they saw ancient Athens in particular as a cautionary tale. And so when James Madison critiqued democracy in Federalist 10, often a phrase brought out to justify this Republican democracy quip, he explicitly meant the Athenian sort of democracy, a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person. He contrasted this with a republic, or a government in which the scheme of representation takes place. And so for him, republic means what we mean when we say democracy. His partner in crime at the time, later adversary for reasons that were political and ideological and also full of drama, Alexander Hamilton, similarly disavowed the ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated. He said their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity. In more modern terms, the founders feared direct democracy and accounted for its dangers with a system of representative democracy. And within that system, they mostly expected things to happen along majoritarian lines. Hamilton may have disdained the ancient democracies, but he also wrote that the fundamental maxim of Republican government was the sense that the majority should prevail. So not only is we're a republic, not a democracy, not really much of a gotcha, it doesn't actually make any sense. The two words are functionally the same thing. One just happens to have Roman origins and the other happens to have Greek ones. So take that to the random person I made up earlier, who is the foil for this part of the lecture. My vindication about this point aside, the reason I bring it up, the reason I wanted to begin with this, is that it provides context for being much more precise about what the framers did oppose. And it wasn't representative democracy, it wasn't necessarily majoritarian rule within a system, a structured system of representative democracy. It was mass politics and mass political participation. This was the thing that bothered them. This is the thing that drove them to take the step of creating a new government. For as much as they expected the government to operate on something like majoritarian principles, they also designed the government as much as possible to exclude the input of ordinary people. If we actually think of the American Revolution as a revolution, as something that brought a leveling spirit to American society, as something that unleashed a spirit of equality, then you can understand the making of the Constitution as a counter-revolution against some of the possibilities that revolution unleashed. There's a larger point I want to make here. We, as Americans, generally, are in the habit of thinking of the Constitution as roughly equal with American democracy, as running along the same boundaries, more or less, that the two things we can speak of as one and the same. But I think that if you just think about the American experience, if you read American history, if you look at how Americans have engaged with their political system and within their political system, I think it's clear that American democracy needs to be considered as a separate thing from the Constitution. Or at least Americans' democratic impulses have often been much, much bigger than what the Constitution allows. You can see some of this in reading the ratification debates and reading the words of the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, whose concerns in part were a fear that the Constitution would foreclose some of the democratic practices that had emerged in the wake of the revolution. The result of American democracy being bigger than the Constitution is that we've often been in conflict with the Constitution. We've had to amend it, obviously. But we've had to bend it and even sort of break it in ways that we kind of retcon after the fact to align our democratic spirit with the institutions of the Republic. It wasn't just because he was a very cranky man that William Lloyd Garrison condemned the Constitution as an agreement with hell, although he was very cranky. His democratic beliefs and his democratic impulses, and those of many of his abolitionist allies, ran into direct conflict with what the Constitution allowed and what the Constitution condoned. We are very clearly and very obviously not a country that has evolved effortlessly toward democracy. We are a country that has only haltingly and with a lot of struggle moved towards something that looks like democracy, that begins to incorporate democratic principles into a system that just wasn't built for it. And one of the principles I think we are still very much struggling to include, one of the principles that matters, is political equality. And it's a principle for which I've also think we've seen quite a bit of retrenchment. So what is political equality exactly? It's worth kind of spelling this out. I shouldn't take it for granted that people know what I mean when I say it. In my view, democracy rests on the idea that no one person or clique or group is entitled to rule. No one. Legitimate government depends on the consent of the governed, and that all citizens have an equal say as to the conduct of that government. You could talk about this in moral terms. You could say that the moral promise of democracy, the reason why it's been so attractive to so many people across history, across recent history, is that it roots the right to govern and roots the right to matter politically in the intrinsic worth of the individual and not in some arbitrary notion of talent or ability or birth or whatever. Political equality, have that in mind, then is the idea that every citizen is entitled to engage in political rule, that every citizen holds the same rank and standing in the eyes of the political system. In its purest form, I think this is a pretty radical concept even still. In its purest form, it's not just a radical rejection of aristocracy and oligarchy, which is what it was when these ideas first started bubbling up, but it's a rejection of modern notions of meritocracy and technocracy. The idea that your achievement should have some bearing on your ability to count, to matter. The idea that your knowledge should have some bearing on your ability to count and to matter. I think political equality cuts against all of these things very sharply. The ideal of political equality, the ideal and the idea, carries an important set of implications as well. And I think it's worth spelling out those implications. First, equal political status implies, or at least provides the foundation for egalitarian social relations. John Rawls made this point somewhat recursively, as he was often wont to do, when he wrote that being related as equals is part both of what citizens are and of what they are recognized as being by others. Political equality then points to a society that is free or more free of relations of hierarchy, of domination, and servility. It is, like I said, a prerequisite for that kind of society. You need a level of equality in political life to be able to achieve some form of equality in social life. It's not for nothing that Karl Marx celebrated the bourgeois revolutions of Europe and bemoaned the reactionary tides against them. He understood that even the incomplete revolutions that didn't really address the social question still laid the foundation for doing so. Closer to home, there's a similar reason why struggles for social equality have often been rooted or begun with a struggle for the vote. There's a recognition that these two things are connected. The other thing about political equality that's worth mentioning for my purposes is that I think it implies a society whose institutions are shaped to secure and affirm and cultivate it, which, I mean, makes sense. How else would you get to that point? But it's important to say that a politically equal society isn't just one where everyone's formally equal, but formally politically equal, but our institutions are there to cultivate that and make sure that we can actually act on it. Now, I've been speaking as if political equality is an obvious good. I think it is, but I shouldn't take that for granted either. So let me explain what I think is good about political equality and why I think it's something Americans should aspire to. The easy and short answer is to go back to what I said a little earlier. It is part of the moral promise of democracy. It's part of the reason democracy holds any appeal in the first place. If you don't believe in a self-governing society of equals, of political equals, then I don't think you, in an important level, believe in democracy. I think you have to accept one to hold a belief in the other. But beyond that, there are other more important, or not more important, but more instrumental values that arise from political equality and that can help us explain why we should treat it as a good thing. It contributes, again, to equal social relations in a more egalitarian society. To spell this out a little bit, citizens who enjoy political equality are more likely to develop and maintain relations between each other that better come close to the egalitarian ideal. They are able to do that more than politically unequal citizens. The way this works out in practice is that just the experience of working together in governing and self-governance can cultivate a sense of equal respect, concern, and treatment in all parts of social life. I do a lot of work with local politics where I live. I'm not going to say that I like everyone I'm engaged in with local politics, but it does engender a kind of mutual respect. You do begin to see people who might exist in a very different social world than you as equals of a sort. And I think that political equality is part of cultivating that egalitarian spirit. To borrow a little from Aristotle, to kind of reverse him a bit, where ruler and ruled are one and the same, friendship can exist between the two. And I think that's an important aspect of what political equality brings to a society. For the sake of illustrating this, let's think of the reverse. Let's think of a society that's politically unequal. Let's think of how, in this politically unequal society, people might relate to each other. Let's imagine a society where the extent of one's political input was determined by one's place in a rigid hierarchy. Hard to imagine in the United States, I know, but bear with me and try to imagine it. People at the top of this society exercise total political freedom, and people at the bottom are largely disenfranchised and dominated. Now, even if the society, through some, let's say, mass social movement, institutes laws against group discrimination, even if it begins to unravel some of this hierarchy, the very fact of its previous existence will inculcate a prejudice against those at the bottom. That's just how these things work. And let's say that as a result of these changes, there's a call for political equality in this society. There's a call for the obliteration of distinctions of political influence. Well, in addition to disrupting the political system, it would very obviously disrupt social relations as well. It might spark a reactionary backlash, an attempt to reestablish patterns of domination, something like that. I don't know, this is all a thought experiment. Now, there is a view that I should acknowledge that puts political equality and equality of all forms in tension with freedom and liberty. That we cannot have more equality without threatening the freedoms that we enjoy and often take for granted, because equality implies against this leveling spirit. I don't want to dismiss this concern, even if I think it's often a little self-serving. I think it often comes from people who are invested in one form of hierarchy or another. But my response is this, that in the United States at least, far from being a threat to fundamental rights and liberties, equality, political equality, social equality, has helped anchor them, has helped make them stronger. You really only need to look at our past, periods of democratic dissolution, periods of disenfranchisement, have coincided with periods where rights for all Americans are really quite weak. And as our democratic institutions have grown stronger, as rights have spread from narrow groups of Americans to larger groups of Americans, freedoms and liberties have become much more robust. They've become much more protected in the political system. This again comes to the idea I want to get out there, that political equality, the reason to want it is it can help us cultivate the kind of free society that Americans say that they want. Now, how does this relate to American democracy as it currently exists? Now that we've gotten away from this question of what is political equality and why does it matter, how does it relate to American democracy as it presently exists? Well, even with all of our strides and advances, which have been very real, I never want to discount those, but even with those strides and advances, democracy in the U.S. as currently organized under our Constitution is marked by profound political inequality, and much of it is by design. It's beyond obvious, to start, that the framers did not think that they were establishing a nation of political equals. Just think about everyone who was in the United States at the time. Think about people who very well were walking past the hall where the Philadelphia Convention was being held. They're inside, and people were walking past it outside. And those people include women. They include African Americans. If you look beyond Philadelphia, they include Native Americans, either within the borders of the U.S. or outside of it. They include a huge number of enslaved Black Americans who were treated legally as chattel, some of whom treated as such by people in the room in Philadelphia. To the extent that the Constitution, as originally written, extended any kind of political equality or freedom to anyone, it was a class of adult white men. And while that class was larger in 1790 than it had been in 1770 or 1750, it was still the case that a substantial number of adult white men in the early republic couldn't vote. Around 30 or 40% weren't really meaningfully part of the political community. And one of the most important things to know about the United States in this regard at this period is that political rights were determined on a state-by-state basis. There was no universal set of basic political rights. There was no floor from which most Americans could stand to participate in the political system. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things, or the thing the framers were really opposed to, at least at the beginning, was mass politics and mass political participation, sort of the general public really engaged in everything. And that is very much the case. It's not for nothing that when faced with a hostile press in the beginnings of an organized political opposition, John Adams' response as president was to try to ban them. And that spoke to an attitude. George Washington's invocation against factions, all of this. Even the founders, essentially, of the early American party system, Jefferson and Madison and so on and so like, they kind of imagined that after they had righted the ship of the republic, parties and factions would go away. That's sort of what Jefferson was referring to when he said his inaugural address for all Federalists, for all Republicans. There's just a opposition to a distaste for mass political participation. And this distaste for mass political participation is evident in the institutional design of the American system. Things all of you, I'm sure, know. At the most egregious example of this, the institution I think that violates principles of political equality the most, is the Senate. In 1790, the largest state was Virginia, with about 750,000 people, and the smallest was Delaware, with about 59,000 people. And so, in the Senate, the average, Virginian, white Virginian at the very least, had 12 times less representation than someone from Delaware. It was pretty bad, but not the worst thing in the world. Today, the largest state is California, with nearly 40 million residents, and the smallest is Wyoming, with just under 600,000. Which is a disparity that gives a person in Wyoming 67 times the voting power of one in California. The wild thing that we don't, I think, talk about nearly enough is that these population disparities are only getting worse as time goes on. In about 20 years, it's estimated that half the population in the United States will live in 8 states, California, Texas, Illinois, New York. There are a few others that I don't remember, Florida. And the remaining half of the population will live in the other 42 states. Which, if you set aside the question of partisanship, like who's going to win which seat, and just think about this in terms of which Americans get the most representation in the political system, it's a bizarre future coming very soon where one half of the population can somehow claim 84 seats in the Senate, and the other half can claim about 16. And all of this is before we get to the ways the Senate, in representing often very demographically homogenous, sparsely populated states, enhances the representation of white Americans above everyone else and diminishes the representation of non-white Americans who tend to live in larger, more dense, more populous states where they don't constitute a majority of the state. There's also, obviously, the Electoral College as far as problems for political equality. The Electoral College, whose rules give the most influence not to citizens of small states or rural states necessarily, but to those who live in the most competitive states. The Electoral College also allows the loser of the popular vote, obviously, to become president. What this sort of means in practice is that most people's votes don't matter in a presidential election. Consider some of how population works out in terms of partisanship when you're looking at presidential elections. There are more people who live in the solidly red rural counties of California, New York, and Illinois than live in Wyoming, Montana, Alaska, and the Dakotas, period. Just like by far, many more people. In 2020, there were more Trump voters in Cook County, Illinois, home to Chicago, which is sort of a bête noire for some conservatives, but there are more Trump voters in that area of the country than there were in all of West Virginia. Trump's share of the vote in Los Angeles County was a little more than 1.1 million people. That's more than the total number of votes he received in Oklahoma, a state he won by more than 30 points. And on the other side, this is true for Biden voters as well, there were twice as many Biden voters in Florida and Texas combined than there were in all of New England plus New York. Just the way this works out, though, is that those voters, they don't really matter for the outcome. They don't really matter for the political parties. There's no real sense in which national political leaders, political parties are trying to attract them, speak to them, represent them in terms of presidential campaigning and presidential elections. I think the extent to which these votes are just wasted, people go out, they take time, they cast a ballot, but the ballot functionally doesn't matter, really does make a mockery of the idea that they count equally. They don't. Obviously, when we get to the issue of the Electoral College misfire, when the popular vote loser wins the presidency, that sort of just throws political equality out the window. And it almost happened in 2020. Biden may have won by 8 million votes in terms of the national popular vote, but his margins in the states that mattered was just 10, 20, 30,000. So if things had gone a little differently, if voter suppression had been a little more effective, if the weather had been worse, you can kind of go down the line here, Donald Trump would have won re-election and Biden's 8 million vote margin wouldn't have mattered, which again makes a mockery of the idea that we're all political equals in this country. I'll say, on the level of just aesthetics, this kind of bothers me as well. I'm a little shallow sometimes. If the Florida Panhandle, for example, if the Florida Panhandle had been part of Alabama, when Florida was carved out, when Alabama was carved out, that's how the borders lined. If the Redneck Riviera, which I can say because my family's from the area, was part of Alabama instead of Florida, then Hillary Clinton probably would have won the presidency. That boundary change would have changed the massive political outcome, which is to say, this is no way to run a democracy, and certainly not the world's oldest democracy, and it's not really any way to run a country, period. The big point, though, the big claim I want to make here is that if political equality demands institutions that reflect it, that cultivate it, that ensure that it's part of our political lives, then it's beyond obvious that the American political system and its institutions do not cultivate political equality, and in fact do the opposite. They can cultivate an attitude that holds that there are large swaths of the population, many Americans, whose votes don't count and shouldn't count. I think we're seeing the implications and the consequences of the cultivation of that attitude right now in our national politics. It's not just institutions, it's also norms of politics. The huge sums of unaccountable money that flow into our political system, they are a challenge to the idea that we're all political equals. The gerrymandering, the extreme gerrymandering that shapes our state legislatures and the House of Representatives also challenges whatever ideal of political equality exists in this country. This is supposed to be a place where one person equals one vote. The Supreme Court said this. At the very least, we're supposed to be a country where one person sort of equals one vote, where it kind of mostly equals one vote, and that we are aspiring to be a place where it fully equals one vote. But that aspiration, for the most part, appears to be in the rearview mirror of American society. It's been plowed over by John Roberts in a Ford F-150. So, excuse me. Let's jump back to money in politics.
I hope I don't just suddenly lose my voice in the middle of this. Let's jump back to money and politics. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United, allowing unprecedented levels of outside spending in elections. Some of us are now, oh, there we go. Some of us are now allowed, oh, there, it's like the volume turning back up. Some of us are now allowed to essentially swamp the speech of others using resources that by their nature are only available to a select few. Or voting rights. The Supreme Court has taken multiple steps to unravel the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Shelby County v. Holder famously gutted the pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act. Knowing that the modern Congress is sclerotic, knowing that it's unresponsive to events, knowing that the filibuster in the Senate creates a de facto supermajority for most legislation. The result of the court's actions in that regard is that the most significant part of the VRA is dead, and it has freed conservative lawmakers in multiple states to push restrictive laws for voter identification, place new limits on registration, slash ballot access. You know the story. And these policies have burdened the groups the Voting Rights Act was supposed to protect the most: the poor, the elderly, foreign language speakers, and people of color. Again, these choices, part of a norm of judicial review, make a mockery of the idea that we're all political equals. And the court's crusade against voting rights is of a piece with its indifference to gerrymandering, which I mentioned earlier. The court has essentially said that it's not going to touch partisan gerrymandering. It's going to allow states to pursue however many and whatever extreme gerrymanders they hope to pursue. These gerrymanders are explicitly designed to neutralize the ability of political minorities in a state to elect representatives of their choosing, to even win power as a majority. You see this in Wisconsin, where it takes close to a supermajority of the statewide vote for Democrats in the state to win a slim majority in the legislature. This form of partisan gerrymandering is, once more, an affront to political equality, and you can think of it as an affront to sort of the basic values of Republican government in the United States, period. If Americans have to struggle under essentially minority rule to choose representatives that represent them, then these are not states you can call republics or democracies or whatever in any meaningful sense. So before I go any further, first I'm going to take another sip of water, and then I'm just going to do a quick recap. We've talked through what political equality is, why I think it's desirable, why I think the American political system needs it, and we've talked through why the institutions and processes of American democracy are hostile towards political equality. And we've talked briefly about the extent to which the U.S. has really moved away from political equality in the laws and norms that might have sustained it over the last decade or the last 15 years. So what now? What comes next? For those of us who care about political equality, for those of us who think that American democracy won't ever really realize itself until full political equality is a part of our constitutional settlement, not just an ideal that we have, but something that we're actively working towards as part of what our Constitution means. What comes next? What do we do about the state of affairs? How do we get back on the track that we left and make a little more progress? I ask those questions rhetorically because I don't necessarily have answers, but I do have thoughts. And I do have thoughts about what it would entail to begin to inject the American political system with political equality. But before I get to those thoughts, I want to make a general observation about democracy in this country. It's beyond obvious that democracy in the United States has not been very democratic, that for most of our history, most Americans have lived in varying states of unfreedom. It's not just African Americans or other racial minorities, it's women, it's most ordinary white men. I mean, if you look at American history, unfreedom is the rule more than freedom, generally speaking. But despite this, despite the prevalence of unfreedom in American history, the U.S. has always maintained this astoundingly democratic culture, right? A culture of public participation that has been open and fluid enough to include people who may have been excluded from the formal political system. And it's within this democratic culture that I think we can find some of the inspiration and intellectual resources that we'll need to renew and expand American democracy. To return to this earlier point that American democracy, in the sense of our culture and our habits and belief, has always been much bigger and much more ambitious than what is available in the Constitution, what the Constitution allows. That's been the case from the very start. It was the case even during the Revolution, and even then American democracy was bigger than what they envisioned. Think about the enslaved Africans who took the words of the Declaration and pressed for their freedom. Think about the rapid development of a mass political culture despite the wishes of the framers, a culture that forced the elites to take the public seriously. Think about Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved Black Americans embarked on a truly remarkable and inspiring attempt to build democracy in the South. Think about the populist movement, when a movement of farmers and workers tried to bring democracy to the economic system. Think about our contemporary struggles for labor, for civil rights, for gender equality. All of these things, I think, reflect a sense among Americans that what we can expect from American democracy is just much greater than what our institutions provide. And I think one way to think of the story of American democracy is of these Americans struggling to align these intuitions and these aspirations about what American democracy actually means with institutions that often don't want it. And often the struggle is very hard. So with that in mind, what are some concrete things that we could do now to make American democracy more democratic, to introduce some political equality into the system? Well, in the abstract, we would need a state that provides rights and opportunities for everyone to participate. All citizens would have to have equal say at the ballot box. All citizens would have equal rights of citizenship, would have to be able to live their lives freely. It would mean a system of public education that allowed and taught all Americans about their role as citizens and not just as consumers in the society. And there would have to be a way for everyone to have an equitable way to shape the agenda of government, sort of political parties that are, at the very least, amenable to being changed and used by citizens. Not all of this is likely to be accomplished in full in the actual world of American society, but I think it can help us think about what reforms would look like. For example, we may be stuck with states, we may be stuck with the Senate in particular as a body that represents the states as states, but we can attempt to do things with the Senate. We can attempt to expand the size, include more federal units within it to deal with some of the problems of representation. We can attempt to split existing states to better allow for representation for those people. 6 or 7 Californias, 3 or 4 Texases, 2 or 3 New Yorks. I think that all sounds great. You can extend representation to territories like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. They don't necessarily need to be states. They can still have voting representation. They are still, the people therein are citizens and are deserving of representation. And if we're thinking really creatively and expansively about what to do about the Senate, we might even decide that we don't want it to have the power to make legislation to begin with, and that we take that power away and leave it for the House and leave the Senate as unequal as it is, but understand that inequality in the Senate doesn't have as much of a concrete impact on the governance of the country. With the House, we can make the House bigger, we can get rid of gerrymandering, we can institute forms of proportional representation or preferential voting or something to encourage the development of more parties, to encourage more representation, to kind of lower the ratio of representation in that chamber. As far as individual American citizens, Oh, and I should mention the Electoral College. We can just end that. It's very straightforward. It's not really that difficult. As far as individual Americans go, there are a host of things that can be done to protect their political rights and begin to bring political equality into the system to a greater extent. I would love a constitution that explicitly protected a right to privacy and a right to vote. But in the absence of amendments to that effect, we can broadly interpret and vigorously enforce the Reconstruction Amendments, which were designed pretty explicitly to bring some measure of equality to American political life. One of the great tragedies of our history, I think, is the extent to which these amendments have been narrowly interpreted to foreclose the possibilities they provide. I think we should make an effort to end not just felon disenfranchisement, but allow the incarcerated to vote. They're still citizens too, and they still deserve a say as well. And that taking representation from one group of Americans, I think, primes the political system to be willing to take it from other groups of Americans. As for the question of money in politics, I think the pursuit of political equality means we need to really strike back at the largely judicial attempt to make American politics a fair ground for the rich. And I think it means we need to restrain the judiciary as well, which has very often been the force restraining the ability of Americans to act as political equals. In general, I think that the pursuit of political equality means taking every step possible to level the political playing field for as many Americans as possible, understanding that this all takes place within a system that wasn't really built for equality of that sort in the first place. We're going to be trying to shove this in like a turducken. I don't know. That's what came to mind. Which I think brings us back to the Constitution and what I think is the problem of the Constitution. I think that if we hope to realize political equality in a real sense in the US, that we need to think about whether we just need a new Constitution to begin with. The old Constitution has its virtues. I've written about them. I can name a lot of things I admire about the old Constitution. I can name a lot of things I admire about the Constitution that emerges after Reconstruction. But we have spent a long time as Americans trying to shoehorn a democratic political system into a very undemocratic document. And I think there's ultimately only so far you can go in that direction. I am personally a fan of theories of constitutional interpretation that seem to open up, right, the Constitution for doing more. But again, there's only so far you can go before you have to try something new, before the undemocratic nature of the institutions themselves begins to assert themselves within the context of the society. I think we're seeing what it looks like when they begin to assert themselves right now. We're seeing how the undemocratic and counter-majoritarian features of the Constitution can be actively and easily weaponized against the democracy we have built. That's what the insurrection was, ultimately, an attempt to take some provisions in the Constitution and weaponize them, turn them against a procedure, a presidential election, which doesn't exist in the Constitution as written, right? It's a norm that's developed, but there's nothing there that demands that the American public has any say, really, in its president. And if you pay attention to the former president's acolytes and supporters and the people who are winning elections for Secretary of State in states across the country, you'll see them talk in very open terms with skepticism about the idea that the Constitution demands that Americans get to choose their leaders. And I think that that's a risk that we're going to always have as long as these institutions exist as they are. Now, tomorrow night, I'm going to talk a little more about what I think would actually take to produce a new Constitution. So if you're coming tomorrow night, you can hear me go on about that somewhat. But if you're not coming tomorrow night, then I'll just say that I'm not as pessimistic as some people who think it would be an utter disaster to let Americans lose on a new Constitution. I think we are still very capable as a nation and as a people of thinking seriously about our institutions, thinking seriously about our political system, and taking steps to reform them. I want to wrap up with a quick observation from the late political theorist Robert Dahl, whose work on democracy has been kind of a huge influence on my own thinking. And Dahl wrote not too long before his death that the only legitimate constitution for a democratic people, it seems to me, is one crafted to serve democratic ends. I've maybe read entirely too much Tocqueville in my life, but I think that Americans are, at the end of the day, a very democratic people. I think we have an instinct for fairness, and I think we deserve institutions that nurture and channel this instinct into something constructive, something that really is worthy of our highest aspirations. I think political equality is where we need to start, but solidarity is where we should hope to end. Thank you. Time for questions. I hope I won't lose my voice during these. Very exciting. So please come up to the microphone. I guess I'll be the one moderating questions.
Good evening, and thank you for the excellent presentation. I have two questions. The first one is, you kind of touched on it toward the end, but I'm curious to know where transparency factors into the equation for political equality, especially when you have non-state actors like Robert Mercer and Jenny Thomas having such a pervasive influence on current events. So that's my first question. And my second question is, in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about misinformation and disinformation. And in recent years, fake news and alternative facts have entered the media lexicon. But my question to you, as a journalist, or as a writer at the New York Times, why not just call it lies and propaganda? Because that's what it is. I mean, in journalism, at least when I was in the business, we were known to call a spade a spade. So what happened? And recently, Dean Baquet, the former executive editor, he seemed tongue-tied, debating whether or not to call the former occupant of the White House a liar. And I'm just wondering what happened, like, why is that? Why not just call a spade a spade? Why not just call it lies and propaganda? Thank you.
As to the transparency question, I think transparency is one of those values that is important in some spaces and not as important in others. I don't think transparency is necessary, for example, to have a well-functioning legislature. I think you can actually make a case that the expansion of transparency in the legislature may have become a problem for lawmaking. But when it comes to who is putting money into the political system, who is attempting to influence it in material ways, I think transparency is very, very important. So I don't include transparency as sort of like a cardinal value. To me, it's a very instrumental thing. What is the purpose we're trying to achieve with transparency? And as for journalists, not calling out lies as lies, I mean, as an opinion journalist, I certainly can just say that. It's great. An advantage of being in that part of the field. I think that the obligations and duties of people who are not just attempting to, reveal things or explain things, but also attempting to do so in a way that enables them to have credibility across the society means that people may have to hold their tongues when they might prefer not to. That's just my read on it.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the great speech. What is your insights onto how to best tap into the sort of generational aspect that's growing in this country, coming from baby boomers to Gen X, and now you have millennials and Gen Z, and as you mentioned, cancel culture. But what's your insights into the best ways of leveraging that huge mass in this country for progressive change?
Yeah. I think that there are a lot of younger Americans who both want to believe that the country can do something for them, that can be a place where they can succeed and prosper, and want political leadership that will express that will not just ask them to come vote to stop the worst thing that might happen, but that will reach out to them and attempt to inspire them to actually build something constructive. I think that's sort of what was the secret sauce behind both the Bernie Sanders' campaigns. I think that, even for as much as some people might view him as a little cringe, I think that's sort of the sauce behind Beto O'Rourke, right? Sort of politicians who are saying to people, to young people especially, that we're capable of doing great things, and we want to do them together, and here's how we're going to get there. And I do think that there's generally a dearth of political leadership in this country right now, a dearth of attempts to not just win the next election, but articulate a coherent vision for what the future might look like. And I think it has something to do with the fact that we have not, for as much as there's been clear generational change in the country, there hasn't really been all that much generational change in America's political leadership. And so I've sort of, over the years, I still very much think structurally about American politics, but over the years I've come really to appreciate the importance and value of strong political leadership and like motivating and galvanizing people towards an aim, towards a cause. And I think that a lot of young people, and it's like people younger than 40, let's say, people who cut their teeth in politics in the late 90s, the early 2000s to the present, have lived through a period of U.S. history where that just really hasn't been available. There have been glimpses of it, right? The Obama campaign in 2008, but even that, very much dissipated afterwards. So I think that's sort of what's missing, and I think it provides an opportunity for whoever decides to try to seize it.
Hello, hi. First, thank you very much for that talk. Very important. And I have a two-part question, but I'll be brief. All the aspects of a lack of democracy that you mentioned are very important, but there's another one, which is that a large number of people in this country have effectively disenfranchised themselves. And they may have excellent reasons for doing so. Their lives are a struggle. They may be disconnected from the larger culture, from the media, from politics in general. And they may well be oppressed and sort of cynically denied access by institutions that do not in fact represent them and do not want to represent them. But the fact remains that they don't vote and they don't elect people who could represent their interests and make them feel more solidarity and connection with the larger society. That's kind of the bottom-up problem. Second part is the top-down problem. The lady who asked the first question mentioned the Mercers and transparency. But you can have all the transparency in the world about the Mercers and the Kochs and the Ulines and on the other side the Soroses or whatever. But we can, if we found out where all the dark money is coming from, would that really change anything? The Supreme Court is still saying that money is speech. What are we going to do about that? I mean, how can someone who's making $7.25 an hour compete with Jeff Bezos? Thank you.
So I'm going to answer your question and kind of go a long way to it. So when I think about, there are large numbers of Americans who just don't participate in politics at all. Often they feel very disconnected from politics. They have better things to worry about. And they don't necessarily see political life as responsive to those things, right? And when I think about, policy solutions, things you could do to get people to participate beyond lowering barriers, you could consider something like compulsory voting, right? Sort of like saying you have to just come vote. You don't have to cast a ballot for a particular candidate, but you do have to come out and vote. But when I imagine something like compulsory voting, reforms of that scale don't just happen because enlightened politicians decide they might be a good idea. They happen because of social movements that push the political system to act and push the political system to do something. And so in terms of the many Americans who sit out, part of me thinks, and if you look at sort of the past of democracy expansion in this country, it's all rested on social movements that push for an expanded democracy, that, the United States is in this period where there are social movements ongoing, but the kind of like broad-based reform movement that used to kind of be in the background of American life doesn't appear to be around right now. And it might simply be that as we do experience democratic backsliding in the country, and I do think we're experiencing it, this is going to be the thing I talk about tomorrow evening, that may be the thing that begins to galvanize the kinds of social movements that might push back against it and might begin to think about what it would mean to expand democracy and include much more people in it. And that sort of, that's partly gets to the second part of your question, right? Sort of like what to do about the money at the top. Well, those people have a lot of money, but there aren't really that many of them. And so one way to challenge them is to swamp them with numbers and organize around them. And at the moment, right, the American right wing is very well organized and very well funded and very sort of dedicatedly pursuing its views. But that doesn't mean that they can't be opposed. It doesn't mean that they can't be pushed back against. And it's going to require again sort of the broad social movements based around civil rights, based around labor, based around gender equality that have done similar things in the past.
I'd also like to thank you for your talk. I thought it was wonderful. I have two questions. One is substantive and the other is extremely not substantive.
I like them both.
Yes. So for my first question, the question that frames the talk today, I think, could be asked justifiably of any number of countries in the world today. The leaders of India and Brazil, two major countries, I think, can justifiably be described as fascists in some sense, or at least share certain aspects of that political program and ideology in what they say and what they do. In the Philippines, we've just seen the son of Marcos get elected to the presidency there. Marine Le Pen just lost her election in France, but came a lot closer than I think any of us would like to see. We see Vladimir Putin, an autocrat, waging war against an extremely imperfect democracy in Ukraine. So it seems like there's a broader sort of crisis of democracy that's taken hold around the world, regardless of what the particular national institutions are. So it seems like, in that sense, it seems there's something kind of more structural going on and something kind of transnational going on. So I guess my question is, do you agree with that proposition? And if so, what in your view is driving it, or what's behind it? And then my second and extremely non-substantive question is, are you and your podcast co-host John Gans going to watch and talk about the movie Chain Reaction, which I watched recently and had a lot of fun watching? So just curious about that. So thank you.
Yeah. So as for the first question, I do agree that there's something structural happening. My like general inclination is that if I don't know a ton about something, I'm gonna stay away from it. And so it's like that is keeping me from basically speculating about what is happening in the world broadly that is producing this sort of democratic backsliding, it's a term, but kind of real hostility to not just democracy, the form or the institution, but sort of the values of equality, the values of individual rights. Since there are still elections in India, right? It's not as if there are no longer elections, but sort of the democratic form exists in a lot of places, but the underlying values are being eroded. My inclination is to look for something material, right? Like something happening in the world system, happening with global capitalism, with the extent to which the past generation, 2 generations have seen like eroding living standards around the world, that the great promise of liberal democracy at the end of the Cold War, liberal democracy and liberal capitalism didn't really play out, and we're kind of seeing the consequences of that. But that both feels right to me, but also feels too simplistic, which is why I try not to speculate too much about it, and I'm very much an observer here. But it does segue into the second part of your question, which is, yes, we will cover the movie Chain Reaction. the general, so the podcast, just I should say, the premise is that my co-host and I, John Gans, who is a writer, who has a Substack, and he's writing a book on the politics of the early 90s. We are looking at the military and political thrillers of the post-Cold War period as sort of like, lenses through which to examine American culture and American politics in the moment. Sort of what does a movie like Falling Down say about where America was in 1993? What does the proliferation of Harrison Ford as beleaguered bureaucrat movies say about the United States at the time? So that's the premise, and there are a lot of movies like this, way more than you would possibly imagine, and we're just gonna work our way through them until we get to the post 9/11 era, at which point I guess we'll do that too. Do we have time for more questions, or one more? We have time for one more question.
Hi, and thank you for your talk. Just real quick, how do you square your theory that social equality comes hand in hand with expanding other rights, with FDR's passage of the New Deal only really coming with the kind of segregation of those public policy programs?
Yeah. So the way I understand that phenomena is I do not see it as like an intrinsic part of the promise of the New Deal, right? Sort of like the use of state power to secure economic life for millions of Americans and to expand inclusion into economic life and to protect people's economic fortunes. I see that as a very contingent result of formations in American politics at the time, right? That the influence and power of the Jim Crow South was such that it placed real limits on how big and how broad the New Deal could go with regards to social equality. But even then, and I think this is an important point to make, even then, even in its limited and circumscribed form, the New Deal did a tremendous amount for African Americans in the North especially, but also in parts of the South, to raise living standards and to begin to include them in democracy. There's a reason, right, why the migration of Black Americans from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party doesn't begin in the 60s or the 40s, it begins in the 1930s. It begins in the 1930s very much, I think, because of a recognition that even for all of its flaws, even for all of FDR's flaws, the New Deal's attempt to create a kind of social citizenship in the United States redounded to the benefit of Black Americans, even if they couldn't enjoy it to its fullest. So that's sort of the perspective I take there, even though I very much take, right, the critique of the New Deal and FDR as being tied up in some pretty ugly stuff as well. Japanese internment has to be mentioned here as well. I think, so that's it for questions, and I'm supposed to wrap up. So thank you for coming. I apologize for almost losing my voice. That's never happened before, but here we are. Thank you.